there emerged a generation of young creators, like Kenneth Copeland, like Peter Darrell, who grew up in this classical tradition, saw it, but were also made aware by the arrival, particularly of Roland Petit, that there was something more than the rather polite world posited by Ashton's ballets, which were beautifully made, very elegant, very charming, very delightful, tra-la-la, and had a faint feeling there were still fairies in the wings waiting to come on. That was not what Macmillan wanted, and it was certainly not what Darrell wanted.
He was taking the classical steps and the classical style and using them to convey sometimes rather surprising subjects. But I think it was almost entirely a classical background that he grew upon.
Their common thing was an interest in drama as a contemporary thing, drama about the world in which they lived and they were growing up and they were seeing all around them. And it was a time of massive social change anyway. This was going on, but also the fact that things needed to look differently.
They wanted to show something which wasn't being shown elsewhere.
Darrell, eventually, when he was, first of all, with Liz West and Western Theatre Ballet, and then in Scotland, knew that he had to find, if not exactly a different way, a way more suited to his means, which were not considerable, and also which reflected his own concerns about social matters, about how people behave, about also the real inner life of people, I mean in the prisoners. I have the most vivid and chilling memories of Suzanne Musitz, was it? Yes. That terrible old cardigan which was buttoned wrongly, which it was buttoned wrongly, so there was a hole up here and a button down there on the other side. They didn't know, and it was, in a funny way, I'm sure it was accidental, but it told you something about the character of this extremely dominating, vengeful, passionate woman.
The Prisoners was, to my mind, the best dramatic ballet made for any British company in that decade, probably over a longer period too.
The Prisoners. Oh, my God. I can remember, I can see it now, it was a matinee in Bath. I've never been more frightened in my life. I mean, I've been bombed and machine gunned and all the rest of it. But, and it was, you see, the solid theatrical values of that piece. It would still work today.
There was Home, which was made for Nadia and Irina, and where Darrell actually brought in an outsider to develop the plot.
It was a work which suddenly revealed Irina not as a ballerina, not as the wonderful jumper, the enchanting Swanilda, the Aurora, anything, but as this very vulnerable and unhappy and confused girl. Her performance, inspired by Darrell, actually winkled out of her by Darrell, was heartrending. It was most beautiful. And I thought, you know, that is in a funny way, it's in essence what Darrell can do.
The Royal Ballet lost through not taking any Darrell influence.
Darrell's ballets were an exact picture of what was going on at that time in the aesthetic life of the country.
He was the first choreographer to think that you could actually do a ballet to music by the Beatles.
how good mods and rockers, of course, totally of its time, wonderful, ballet of its time, not fair in sight.
I think the reaction, as far as critics were concerned, was that at that time they knew nothing about the Beatles. They'd heard of them, but here was this music which they'd heard of and didn't really know, and Darrell is using it to make a work which has a very definite atmosphere of the time.
If you want to know, what was it like in 1966? What was Darrell doing? You know. It'll tell you what young people are interested in. It told you a great deal about all the things that these particularly sensitive men, like Roland Petit, I have to say in this way, that they resonated to the noise of their time. Darrell certainly did.
I think he was simply interested in so many different ballet scores.
Darrell had a native and natural good musical taste.
He was looking specifically for music which either had been intended for dancing or which would fit perfectly with dance. I think that was his attitude.
Ballet was part of the theatre. It was not something apart. It was not the kind of curious contortion. It was not Balanchinian in the sense that the dance was all.
He never wanted just to show pure dance on stage without anything more than that. He always wanted his choreography to convey something to the audience.
Darrell also was an absolute marvel at making choreography. Whatever it needed, Darrell could make it. In that square of the stage, he knew where everything had to be. He knew how it had to work. He knew what he wanted to see. And he had the wit and the talent and the eye to get it right.
Peter gave Scotland something that worked and that could have continued much further than it did.
After a quarter of a century, what remains?
I think it's a great shame that the work didn't endure. I think it should have done.
So much of that work, now lost, should not have been lost. We need to preserve works of their time, because they are of their time. You know, mods and rockers, you know. We ought to know about that. How it looked, how dance reflected that, how ballet reflected that. He was a man of the theatre. He could do anything.